Ladies and gentlemen, this is ECON211 Macroeconomics. We are busy with study unit 3, which is chapter 7 in Fourie and Burger. This is the third video in the series, and it focuses specifically on the concept of the Phillips curve. In 1958, the economist A.W. Phillips described the relationship between nominal wage inflation and unemployment. Now, he went and he simply collected data about the inflation of nominal wages and the level of unemployment and plotted it on a graph, and he found this sort of negative relationship between the two variables. Now, over time, the nominal wage inflation was replaced by just the inflation rate. And you can see that the shape of this Phillips curve implies a trade-off, that it's possible to have a high level of inflation and a low level of unemployment, or a low level of inflation and a high level of unemployment. And of course, this trade-off, this negative relationship, was really important to policymakers who could then decide what are their views on what do they want for the economy and start influencing that. Of course, there are differences between the short and the long run Phillips curve. In the short run, you typically find this negative relationship, but in the long run, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment becomes less clear, and the Phillips curve takes on a vertical shape, that it's a simple straight line with the unemployment rate fixed at the structural equilibrium that doesn't have a positive or a negative relationship with the inflation rate. In the 1970s, the data showed that the Phillips curve may shift around depending on shocks hitting the economy. Specifically, there were supply shocks that produced price increases along with a drop in real income. In other words, also along with an increase in unemployment. So for a while during the era of stagflation, it was possible to have increasing inflation and increasing unemployment, which would make for a positive relationship between the two. Now, these days, there's a lot of debate about whether the Phillips curve exists in the South African economy, for example, and whether it should be exploited by policymakers over the short run or not. The kind of lessons that we draw for policymakers are firstly that an increase in the rate of spending growth will eventually lead to inflation. So whether it's an increase in investment or in government spending or even in exports, those increases eventually lead to some inflation. But if these increases are continual and repeated, it actually increases the rate at which inflation increases. And you have continually increasing inflation, which is obviously not a good thing. If you want to permanently reduce the unemployment rate below the structural rate, that can only be done at the cost of increasing inflation. So pushing the economy beyond its regular operating limits to reduce unemployment will lead to inflation in the long run. So if the government wants to use its spending to really improve the economy, the trick should be to design that spending to add to the productive capacity of the economy, moving that long-run supply curves to the right. Then the inflation penalty for expansionary policy will not be as high. Of course, that means spending on infrastructure, spending on skills development, and not spending on the demand side of the economy. So the policymakers can only really stimulate the demand side if the level of output is lower than the long-run structural level. In other words, if there's a recession, then it is possible to stimulate aggregate demand without having too much inflation in the system. Otherwise, the aim should always be to rather aim for the supply side and the productive capacity of the economy. To conclude, this ends our analysis of the economy in terms of aggregate demand and supply. In Chapter 8, we change gear and we look at the very long run and theories of long-run economic growth, specifically the Solo model. And then we conclude this module with the policy issues, specifically the challenges facing South Africa in Chapter 12. Stay tuned.